The town of Greystone lay quiet under the burning noon sun, the kind of silence that carried warnings inside it. Wind pushed dust across the open street, and the only movement came from a frightened orphan boy running barefoot toward the well. His small frame shook, his breath broke in sharp gasps, and it was clear he had been chased for a while. Folks glanced at him, but no one stepped forward. People in these parts had learned to protect themselves first, and pretend they saw nothing that could bring trouble. Only one woman moved, a young widow named Liren. Dressed in a worn prairie dress, stepped out from beside the old barn, with steady eyes fixed on the boy. Something in the way he stumbled, something in the way he shielded his bruised arm, told her he had no one. She crossed the dusty road before he fell, catching him by the shoulders and pulling him close. Her voice was low, warm, the kind of voice that could calm a storm. She asked him where he had come from, but the boy only shook his head and clung to her like someone who finally felt safe. The town sheriff. And his riders had been looking for this child since sunrise. They accused him of stealing food from a wagon and spying near the ranch lines. Folks whispered that he was not just any boy. Some said he came from Apache lands. Others said he escaped from a camp north of the river. Whatever the truth was, Liren saw only a frightened child needing help. That was enough to make enemies. The sheriff's deputies gathered around. Within minutes, dust rose beneath their boots as they dismounted, faces cold and ready for trouble. Leading them was a tall rider named Huxley, known for treating fear as weakness. He demanded she step aside. The child trembled behind her skirt, but she refused to move. She felt her heart pounding, yet she kept holding the boy's hand. Huxley glared at her, the way a man stares at someone who suddenly stops being easy to control. He told her she had no right to interfere. She told him the boy had done nothing wrong. She stood straight, even when two deputies stepped closer, hands hovering near their belts. A few townsfolk peeked from windows but stayed hidden. No one wanted trouble with deputy riders who believed rules belonged only to them. Liren's refusal made them furious. Words turned sharp. Threats were thrown. They pushed her back. Not enough to injure her, but enough to show what they could do if she kept standing in their way. Her knees hit the dirt, but she pulled the boy down with her, covering him with her arms. The men laughed at her boldness, but that laughter carried something mean inside it. That moment marked her not as a widow trying to help, but as someone who challenged their power. Huxley gave an order, and two deputies grabbed the boy by his arms. Liren held on so tightly her hands burned. The child screamed her name, and that scream echoed across the open land. She begged them to stop, but they pulled the child away and pushed her aside, making her fall again. Her palms scraped against the dirt, yet she rose once more. Her dress was covered in dust, her hair loose, her voice trembling but steady. She shouted that the boy needed protection. They shouted back that she needed to learn her place. They mistreated her. In front of everyone, dragging her away from the center of town while the boy cried for help. A group of riders circled them, laughing, mocking, acting like she had committed a crime by caring. They called her stubborn, foolish, and claimed she should not defend someone who was not her blood. She told them a child was a child, and no one deserved to be treated like an animal. Her words only made them angrier. That was when one of the older townsmen warned them to stop. He said a stranger had been seen on the ridge earlier, a tall warrior on horseback. Some said he was Apache. Some said he had been following the boy for days. The deputies ignored the warning. They said no Apache would dare come this close to Greystone, not with armed riders standing by. They were wrong. Before the men could drag the boy farther, the ground trembled under the steady rhythm of hooves. A dust cloud rose behind the old barn and moved toward the town center. Riders paused. A few stepped back. Even the sheriff's horse jolted. Out of that cloud came a powerful stallion, dark and muscled. Carrying a warrior who sat tall and unshaken, his name was Raiden, known along the frontier for his strength and calm fire. His long hair flowed with the wind, his chest bore the marks of battle, and his eyes held the kind of silence that warned others to reconsider their actions. Raiden's presence carried the old spirit of the land, the rugged wildness of the frontier, and a force that made even hardened riders swallow their pride. He halted his horse in front of them, not saying a word. His gaze landed first on Liren, then on the orphan boy struggling in a deputy's grip. Something fierce tightened in his jaw, the kind of fierce that spoke of loyalty and promise. The riders felt the air change. The wind cooled. The silence sharpened. Men who had laughed moments earlier stood frozen. Liren stared up at him with tearful eyes, unsure if she had been saved or if another danger had arrived. She felt her breath catch as Raiden dismounted. His boots hit the ground with slow, controlled steps as he walked toward the deputies. He did not raise a weapon. He did not shout. He did not warn them. He simply moved with a strength that made the riders tense. Huxley stepped forward, trying to act unbothered. He told Raiden this was none of his business. He demanded the warrior leave. But the Apache stood tall, unmoving, with the kind of steady power that came from knowing he fought for something righteous. His voice finally broke the silence, deep and calm, telling them to release the child. The deputies laughed, thinking they held the upper hand in a single breath. The laughter died. Raiden's commanding presence pushed through the air like a storm. His voice hardened as he repeated his order. The riders felt something in him that no man could fake. It was not a threat. It was truth. It was the warning of a warrior who would not allow harm to fall on a child, or the woman who had shielded him. One deputy stepped back. Another lowered his eyes. The sheriff swallowed hard, sensing trouble greater than anything he had prepared for. The stallion behind Raiden snorted, kicking dust into the air. The wind shifted around them, carrying the old scent of wild plains and the untamed frontier. Raiden stepped closer until his shadow fell over the men holding the boy. His eyes never blinked, his jaw never softened. His voice dropped to a tone that made every rider stiffen. He told them to bow, and in that breath, the whole town of Greystone wondered whether the men would fight, or whether this Apache warrior had arrived from the wild lands to rewrite everything they thought they controlled. The next moment would change all their lives, and nothing in Greystone would ever be the same again. Raiden's command settled over the dusty street like a sudden weight, and for a moment no one moved. The riders, who had been loud and sure of themselves, now stood stiff, confused by the force of a single man's presence. The boy still trembled in the deputy's hold, and Liren felt her heart thudding so loudly she could almost hear it. She didn't know who Raiden truly was, but she knew from the way the deputies froze that he was not a man lightly crossed. Huxley tried to steady himself, puffing his chest as if a show of confidence could hide the crack running through his courage. He said no one in Greystone would bow to an outsider, especially not to a lone Apache warrior with no authority in town. But Raiden didn't even look his way. His attention stayed locked on the boy, then on Liren, studying them both with a depth that seemed to carry its own questions. No one bowed. Not yet, but no one dared take another step either. That tension gave Liren just enough time to reach the boy again. She knelt beside him, brushing dust off his face. The child clung to her sleeve, like it was the only safe thing in the world. She whispered that everything would be fine, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Still, her voice carried a warmth that made the boy's breathing ease a little. Raiden's gaze softened when he saw her doing that. It was only a flicker, but enough to reveal something hidden beneath the warrior's strength. There was recognition there, or maybe respect, as if he had seen someone stand like this before. Someone brave enough to protect the small and the helpless. Someone who chose compassion even in danger. But Huxley's anger boiled the longer the silence stretched. He refused to be outshined in front of his own riders. He shouted at Raiden again, demanding he state his purpose. He wanted to show the crowd he was still in control. The town watched from windows, behind barrels, from the shadows of the general store. People whispered about the Apache on horseback who dared face an armed group alone. Some felt admiration, others fear. Raiden finally answered. His voice held no loudness, but each word landed with certainty. He said the boy belonged under his protection, and anyone laying a hand on him would face consequences. The deputies exchanged looks, unsure what to do. Huxley tried to claim the boy was a thief, a wanderer with no home, a burden that needed correction. Yet none of his words carried the confidence they had before. Liren rose to her feet, placing herself between the men and the child again. She said the boy hadn't harmed anyone. She said he needed safety, not punishment. She said Greystone had lost its heart if people could ignore cruelty against a child. Her voice cracked, not from fear, but from the deep ache of watching injustice unfold. That was when whispers began. Not from the crowd, but from the deputies themselves. One of them, a younger rider with uncertainty in his eyes, asked Huxley if they were sure the boy had truly stolen anything. Another muttered that maybe they had acted too quickly. Their loyalty thinned with each breath of fear growing inside them. Raiden's presence had shaken more than their authority. It had shaken their belief that they could treat people however they liked, but Huxley didn't care. He stepped forward until he stood face to face with Raiden. He was taller by a small measure, yet Raiden's calm posture made him seem larger. Huxley warned him that Greystone followed its own rules, and anyone who interfered would face the consequences. Raiden didn't waver. He didn't lift a weapon. He only repeated that the boy had faced enough pain and would face no more under his watch. The wind stirred dust around them, carrying the faint scent of sage and distant rain. Liren felt the air shift again, as if something old and powerful had returned to the land. She couldn't explain it, but she sensed that Raiden wasn't just any Apache. He moved with the steadiness of someone who carried history in his blood. Someone forged by hardship, loyalty, and a silent code of honor that didn't need words. Huxley finally pointed his finger at Liren, accusing her of harboring someone suspicious. He said people like her were the reason Greystone had trouble with outsiders. That struck a deeper chord than he expected. Liren had lived quietly for years, ever since losing her husband to a fever that took half their ranch. She had earned her place through honest work, helping neighbors, and raising crops on harsh soil. She'd never caused trouble, but she also never backed down from doing what was right. Still, she felt the sting of being singled out. She felt the weight of her late husband's memory pressing against her heart. She wondered why people forgot kindness so easily when fear walked by. Raiden stepped forward again, placing himself near Liren and the boy. Not too close, but close enough to make it clear he would protect them. The crowd sensed something deeper happening, something that stretched beyond a single afternoon of conflict. A connection had begun forming between the brave widow, the orphan child, and the Apache warrior who refused to be intimidated. The tension rose when a ranch bell rang in the distance. Some riders turned their heads uneasy. A bell meant someone was signaling trouble from outside town. Huxley ordered 2 men to check it, but they hesitated, glancing at Raiden as if unsure whether leaving now meant abandoning their leader during a rising storm. The sheriff himself finally stepped forward. He had been quiet until this moment, but the situation had reached a point that demanded his voice. He asked Raiden what the child meant to him and why he had followed him this far. Raiden remained silent for a long breath. When he answered, his words carried weight, but not explanations. He simply said the boy was tied to a promise, and promises were not something he broke. No one knew what that meant exactly, but it stirred curiosity in every listener. Liren wondered if the child had a family among Raiden's people, or if he carried something important. The boy refused to let go of her hand, but his eyes darted to Raiden with a mixture of fear and trust. Suggesting a history neither of them understood yet, Huxley tried to accuse Raiden of kidnapping, but the sheriff raised a hand, signaling him to stop. For the first time, Huxley's authority faltered. Even the sheriff sensed that this situation was larger than the usual disputes in town. He asked Liren what the boy had told her. She explained he hadn't said anything, only that he was scared and alone. The sheriff's gaze deepened, as if he suspected there was more hidden beneath the silence. Suddenly, the boy tugged Liren's hand and pointed toward the ridge. A thin column of smoke rose in the far distance. Raiden turned his head sharply, recognizing something the crowd didn't. His expression tightened, revealing danger that had nothing to do with the men standing before him. Some riders shifted nervously, sensing trouble coming their way from beyond the town lines. Huxley demanded to know what the smoke meant. Raiden didn't answer, but the boy pressed himself against Liren's side, as if whatever caused that smoke was something he feared far more than the Deputies. Liren glanced from the smoke to Raiden. She asked if the boy's family was in danger. Raiden didn't confirm or deny it. Instead, he said the boy carried knowledge someone didn't want him to share. He said that was why he was being hunted. And he said Greystone wasn't the only place searching for him. The sheriff stiffened. The deputies exchanged uncertain glances. Huxley looked at the boy with new suspicion, but also growing fear. A distant thud echoed across the land, like a horse galloping hard toward town. Then another. And another. The sound grew louder, closer. Carrying the urgency of riders who didn't come for peaceful reasons, Raiden stepped back, placing a protective line between Liren, the boy, and whatever approached. His hand rested lightly near the weapon at his side, but he hadn't drawn it yet. The stallion behind him snorted again, stamping the dirt as if preparing for action. The crowd scattered. Windows slammed shut, doors locked. The quiet town suddenly felt like a place caught in the eye of a storm. Huxley grabbed his rifle, shouting for his men to brace themselves. But his voice shook. Even he sensed that the danger arriving was nothing he could control. Liren crouched beside the boy again, her body shielding him. She felt a cold fear, but she also felt something stirring inside her, something strong and steady. She whispered that she wouldn't let anyone harm him. Raiden heard her words. He looked at her with a depth that carried both thanks and warning. Then the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, rising fast. Riders were coming, and whoever they weren't slowing down. The story of why the boy had been hunted, why Raiden had followed him across harsh land, and why Greystone was now wrapped in danger, was finally about to break open, but not before the storm reached its peak. The dust cloud rose higher, swallowing the clear line of the horizon until it looked like the land itself was moving. The sound of hooves beat against the dry earth, each thud pushing deeper into the nerves of everyone standing in the street. Liren tightened her arms around the boy as he buried his face against her. Raiden watched the approaching riders without a flicker of fear, though his shoulders grew even more still. That stillness carried more warning than any shout. The riders broke through the haze at a fast, disciplined pace. These were not ranch hands or wandering cowboys. Their coats were long, their hats pulled low, rifles strapped across their saddles with practiced ease. At their center rode a man in a dark vest, a silver badge that was not from Greystone pinned under his collar. He looked like someone who moved from town to town, carrying law where it suited him and profit where it didn't. They drew their horses to a sharp halt a few yards from Raiden, Huxley, the sheriff, and the crowd. Dust swept past them like a curtain falling. The man with the badge scanned the street, taking in the tense faces, the widow in the dirt, the orphan boy clutching her dress, and the Apache warrior standing like a wall. He introduced himself as Marshal Kellen, claiming he carried orders from the territorial judge and had tracking rights over a runaway boy. His voice carried the tone of someone used to obedience. He said the child was suspected of aiding criminals in Apache country and had to be taken into custody for questioning. He spoke clean official words, yet there was something cold in the spaces between them. Raiden did not step aside. He said the boy was no criminal and that the accusations were lies. Kellen studied him with a narrow gaze, clearly weighing what kind of man dared contradict a marshal in front of everyone. Huxley seized the moment, saying the town had already tried to arrest the boy and that Raiden had interfered. He tried to shift blame, to make it seem like Greystone had only done its duty until an Apache interfered with the law. The sheriff frowned at that, uneasy with the half-truths. He knew his deputies had rushed in with more force than sense. He also knew his town already walked a thin line with the ranchers nearby, who feared trouble with Apache warriors. Any sign that Greystone sheltered someone marked by outside law could bring unwanted attention, maybe even soldiers. Yet the sheriff could not ignore the way Raiden stood protectively between the child and danger, or the way Liren had thrown herself forward with no weapon except her own courage. Marshal Kellen dismounted with a heavy step, boots striking the ground in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He walked closer, first looking down at Liren. He asked if the boy was hers. She said no, but that did not matter. He asked if the boy had spoken to her about where he came from. She shook her head. The marshal's eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, as if judging whether she could be pressed or frightened or used. Raiden stepped slightly in front of her, drawing Kellen's attention back where it belonged. The Apache warrior told him the boy had seen things men in power wanted buried, and that was why they had sent riders. Kellen laughed softly at the suggestion, but a tightness came into his jaw that betrayed him. He said Raiden was meddling in matters beyond his understanding. Raiden replied that some things were simple, no matter how men tried to dress them in paper and stamps. A child hunted was a wrong that needed to be stopped. The boy flinched when Kellen's gaze fell on him. His fingers dug into Liren's arm as if he expected to be torn away at any moment. Liren felt his tension and gently smoothed his hair. The simple touch of a frontier woman trying to give comfort in a harsh world. She asked the boy if he knew these men. He whispered something only she and Raiden could hear. Whatever he said made Raiden's eyes narrow and Liren's heart grow heavier. Kellen noticed the way they reacted and grew impatient. He told the sheriff he had orders and would not leave without the boy. He laid a folded paper on the crate beside him, the seal pressed into the wax as proof. The sheriff stared at it, knowing that refusing a marshal could pull Greystone into trouble with the territorial capital. Yet he also knew that everything about this visit felt wrong. While the men argued, the town's smaller stories moved beneath the surface. The young deputy who had first questioned Huxley's harshness stood at the edge of the riders, hands twitching on his belt. His name was Coulter, a farm boy turned lawman who had joined the force hoping to protect people, not crush them. Now he watched Kellen and Huxley stand on the same side, and his stomach turned. He remembered the fear in the boy's eyes when they grabbed him. He remembered Liren's voice shaking as she begged them to stop. Somewhere inside, a quiet line was forming that he knew he would one day have to choose which side of near the general store. The owner, Merrick, watched from behind the counter, fingers drumming against a worn ledger. Trade had been shrinking for months. Ranchers rode through town less, taking their business to places with better roads and fewer rumors of trouble. Merrick saw this clash as another nail in Greystone's coffin. Yet he also knew he could not pretend not to see injustice forever. His own daughter had once been lost during a winter storm before neighbors found her and brought her back. The thought of a child being hunted sat badly with him. Back in the street, tension tightened like a rope pulled from both ends. Kellen insisted on taking the boy. Raiden insisted that would not happen. Huxley muttered about teaching the outsider a lesson. The sheriff lifted both hands, trying to calm everyone, saying this could be handled without guns. The boy kept his eyes on Raiden, as if that warrior was the only steady thing in a world spinning out of control. Finally, Kellen offered what he called a compromise. He said Raiden could come along if he wished, to see that the boy was treated fairly. He claimed the child would be questioned at an outpost and returned if found innocent. His tone was smooth, but there was something too easy in the offer. Raiden knew it. Liren knew it. Even Coulter at the edge of the line sensed a lie. Raiden asked where the outpost was. Kellen named a remote valley north of the river, near lands where Apache families had once lived, before being driven away. Raiden's face changed at that. He knew those lands. He knew who controlled them now. And he knew no child taken there came back unchanged. Huxley, hungry for favor in the marshal's eyes and jealous of Raiden's quiet command, urged the sheriff to accept. He painted the Apache warrior as a danger, someone who would bring more of his people if not stopped. He told the crowd that if the boy went with the marshal, Greystone would be safe, work would go on, ranches would be left alone. Safety in exchange for a single frightened child. It sounded simple. Liren could not stay silent. She told the town that safety bought by sacrificing the weak was not true safety. She reminded them of the days when neighbors helped each other through droughts and sickness. When the town shared food during floods, when her own husband had ridden out at night to guide lost travelers back to warmth. She asked what kind of people they had become if they could watch a boy taken by strangers, just because a sealed paper said so. Her words stirred some hearts. A widow crossed herself on the porch. A ranch hand beside the livery shifted uncomfortably. Even the sheriff lowered his head, reminded of better days when the town felt smaller, but kinder. Yet fear still held many of them. Fear of law, Fear of Apache? Fear of change? Raiden finally broke the silence that followed Liren's plea. He said there was another truth. This boy had escaped from a slaughter in the valley Kellen had named. Raiden's people had heard distant shots and seen smoke. When they found the camp, the wagons were burned and the bodies left without rights. Only one small trail of footprints led away, and Raiden had followed. He had discovered the boy half-starved near the canyon, clutching an object wrapped in cloth against his chest. The boy's arms tightened around something under his shirt now, as if he feared it would be taken. Liren noticed and gently asked what he carried. The boy did not answer, but his silence only deepened the mystery. Raiden looked at Kellen, knowing in that moment that the marshal did not just want a witness. He wanted whatever the boy protected. Kellen's face hardened when Raiden spoke of the burned camp. He claimed it had been raiders, nothing more. He said the boy's memory could not be trusted. He accused Raiden of twisting a tragedy into a story against authorities. Yet the way his eyes flickered toward the boy's chest betrayed his true focus. The sheriff sensed the shift and asked the boy directly whether he wanted to go with Kellen. The child shook his head in a quick, fierce motion and pressed closer to Liren. That simple gesture cut through all the titles and badges. The boy did not trust the marshal. He trusted a broken widow and a silent Apache warrior. Still, Kellen did not yield. He warned the sheriff that if Greystone refused to hand the boy over, the town could be marked as harboring a fugitive. Supplies could be cut. Patrols could circle it. Traders could be ordered elsewhere. The town would slowly dry like a riverbed, abandoned by rain. It was not just the boy now. The whole future of Greystone hung in the balance. Raiden understood the trap. Kellen used fear of survival as a weapon, the same way others had used it against Apache families, pushing them off their lands. Now the same pressure would be turned on this small town. He looked at Liren, at the boy, at the sheriff, at young Coulter shifting his weight with worry. He understood that whatever choice they made would tie their lives together in ways none of them had planned. The marshal gave them until sundown to decide. He ordered his men to make camp just outside town, near the dry creek bed. The riders turned their horses and moved off, dust rising behind them. Kellen paused long enough to warn Raiden that if he tried to flee with the boy, he would be hunted without mercy. Raiden met his gaze, unshaken. When the riders left the main street, the tension did not vanish. It merely changed shape. People spilled from their hiding places, talking in low voices, their fears and loyalties tangled. Some said they could not risk the town. Others said they could not give away a child. Old grudges rose, old debts were remembered. Old kindnesses weighed against fresh fear. Liren led the boy to the shade beside the well, her hands still trembling. She felt torn between the safety of the town she loved and the life of the child she barely knew. Raiden joined them, standing close enough to shield them from passing stares. The sheriff came too, his face lined deeper than before, as if the day had added years to his life. Sundown was coming, and with it, a choice that would test what kind of people they truly were, and how far an Apache warrior, a lonely widow, and a frightened orphan boy were willing to go to stand against the law that felt more like a threat than justice. The sun sank slowly toward the far hills, painting the dry land in orange light that seemed too gentle for a day carrying such heavy choices. Greystone's streets had emptied except for a few shop owners sweeping dust from their doorways with tense shoulders. The whole town felt like it was holding its breath. Sundown was approaching. Marshal Kellen's deadline marched with it. Liren stood with the boy near the well, her hand resting on his back as though she feared he might disappear if she let go. Raiden remained beside them, silent, watching the horizon where Kellen's men had set their camp. Smoke from their fire curled upward like a warning. The boy kept glancing toward that smoke, then quickly looking away. As if afraid to see something hidden inside it, the sheriff approached them with heavy steps. He looked older than he had that morning, his badge dulled in the dimming light. He said he had spoken with the townsfolk, and they were divided. Some believed handing over the boy would protect their ranches and families. Others thought it would stain their souls forever. He admitted he didn't know which choice would bring peace or disaster. Liren listened quietly, though her heart already knew which choice she stood with. She knelt beside the boy and gently wiped dirt from his cheek. She told the sheriff that she couldn't abandon a child to strangers who gave no sign of mercy. Her voice shook, but her resolve held firm. The sheriff nodded, though uncertainty still pulled at his thoughts. Raiden lifted his gaze from the horizon and finally spoke. He said the boy had escaped something terrible, something Kellen wanted to bury. He said the people in that valley were not raiders, but families traveling together, seeking safer land after being pushed out from their home range. He had seen their camp, seen the destruction left behind. The boy had been the only one small enough to hide in the canyon crevice where Raiden found him. The sheriff grew pale. He asked if Raiden believed Kellen's men were involved. Raiden didn't answer outright, but he said the shooters knew exactly what they were doing. He said they aimed for silence, not justice. The sheriff looked toward the marshal's camp with a long, troubled stare. His whole life had been spent believing the territorial law, even with its flaws, stood for order. Now he wasn't sure. As daylight thinned, the town gathered in small groups, whispering. Some pointed toward Raiden with gratitude growing in their eyes. Others kept their distance, worried this would bring the war they feared. A few argued openly, voices rising near the livery. The tension thickened with each passing minute. Young Deputy Coulter approached Raiden and Liren, his hat in his hands. He said softly that he didn't trust Kellen. He had seen the way the marshal's men handled prisoners before, when they passed through another settlement last spring. He said they acted like wolves pretending to guard sheep. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how without turning against his own badge. Raiden looked him in the eyes and told him a badge meant nothing if the man behind it ignored truth. Coulter swallowed hard, because he knew it was true, and because he feared the cost of doing what was right. The boy finally spoke then, voice small but clear. He said the men who burned the wagons wore the same long coats as the riders in Kellen's camp. His thin hand pointed toward the horizon. Liren felt the boy shaking, and she wrapped her arm around him. The sheriff's face twisted with grief, realizing the law he trusted had been used as a shield for men who dishonored it. Before they could say more, a loud whistle echoed from the north side of town. Dust spun in the fading light as a ranch worker rode hard through the main street, shouting that more riders were approaching from the far ridge. He didn't know whose they were, only that there were many. The sheriff cursed under his breath. Trouble from two sides was more than Greystone could face. Huxley appeared from behind the stable, angry and sweating. He accused Raiden of calling for his own warriors. He said Apache scouts must have arrived to take back the boy and bring chaos with them. Raiden shook his head, saying his people would not step onto Greystone land unless forced by necessity. But Huxley refused to believe him. When the distant riders came into view, their silhouettes were faint but unmistakable. They were not Apache. Their hats were wide, their jackets long, their horses moving in practiced formation. More of Kellen's men. A whole second unit heading toward town. The sheriff's breath hitched. He said the marshal had never intended to negotiate. He had been buying time for his reinforcements to corner the boy in silence. Anyone who stood in the way, Liren felt her stomach drop. But she placed her hands on the boy's shoulders, shielding him as best she could. Raiden stepped in front of them both, his stance widening, his jaw tightening. For the first time all day, he looked ready to fight, not just to defend. Coulter ran to gather the other deputies, but Huxley blocked him. He said they should join the marshal, not resist. He said siding with Raiden would turn Greystone into an outlaw refuge. He told Coulter he'd lose his badge if he didn't obey. Coulter turned away, torn in two directions at once. As the incoming riders drew closer, the town buzzed with rising fear. Mothers hurried their children indoors. Merchants locked shutters. A few men with rifles stepped out from porches, unsure which direction to point their barrels. Merrick from the general store gathered neighbors, whispering that if they gave the boy up now, there would be no safety for anyone who dared speak against the law later. People listened, shaken by the truth in his voice. The ground trembled under the hooves of the second. Marshal group as they reached the outskirts of town. They slowed, spreading out in a semicircle, cutting off the north exit. Kellen's first group gathered on the south side. Greystone was becoming a trap. Raiden stepped forward, pushing Liren and the boy behind him. The The sheriff moved beside him, no longer hiding his fear. He told Raiden he didn't know how to protect a town surrounded by lawmen who had abandoned the meaning of justice. Raiden said the only path was truth, and sometimes truth demanded standing your ground even when outnumbered. Huxley shouted that they were all fools, that Kellen would spare the town if they handed over the child. He reached for the boy's arm, but Raiden grabbed his wrist with a force that made Huxley freeze. The look Raiden gave him was not angry, but cold, the kind of cold that came from deep conviction. Huxley yanked his hand back, unsure whether to draw his weapon or run. The sheriff finally ordered everyone to hold position. He said no child would be taken until he had spoken directly with Kellen again. He rode toward the marshal's southern camp with slow, heavy movements. Raiden watched him go, but stayed ready. Liren held the boy close. She whispered that she wouldn't let anything happen to him. The boy nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the riders forming around the town. He clutched the object under his shirt tighter than before. Raiden noticed. He knelt before the boy and gently asked what he carried. This time the boy slowly pulled out the bundle, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a small wooden carving shaped like a hawk, but not a simple toy. Its base had symbols etched with meticulous hands. Liren leaned forward, recognizing one of the symbols. She had seen it once in an old trader's book. It was a territorial crest used in official meetings, meant only for documented agreements. The sheriff reached them just as Raiden turned the carving in his hand. He explained that the wooden hawk wasn't a toy. It was a marker given during treaty negotiations used to seal agreements between traveling families and territorial officers. Its presence proved that the families in the valley had met with officials for peaceful reasons. The destruction of their camp meant someone had betrayed that agreement, and the only person who had been nearby during those days was Marshall. Kellen. Everyone around them drew in a sharp breath. The boy whispered that he saw Kellen at the camp before the attack. He had heard him arguing with one of the wagon leaders. He remembered being told to hide until things calmed. But instead of calm, he heard gunfire. He saw shadows moving between flames. He ran. Raiden's jaw hardened. Liren felt her pulse quicken. The sheriff looked sick. This was no runaway child case. This was evidence of a crime. Powerful men wanted erased. The sun's last light slipped behind the ridge. Kellen's second unit advanced a little more, eager for darkness to cloak their moves. The sheriff returned to the group, shaking with anger. He said Kellen denied everything, claimed Raiden had poisoned the boy's mind, accused Greystone of harboring traitors. He said at sundown he would take the boy by force. Liren felt the boy cling to her like his life depended on her heartbeat. In a way, it did. Raiden stood tall, scanning both groups of riders. He said they had two choices: stand and face the marshal, or break out before nightfall swallowed them. The sheriff asked where they would go. Raiden answered that there was a canyon south of Greystone, hidden from sight, known only to a few. If they reached it before Kellen sealed the trap, they could buy time to reveal the truth. Huxley called them mad. He said fleeing would make them fugitives. Coulter stepped forward then, voice steady for the first time that day. He said that maybe justice wasn't what the papers said. Maybe justice started with saving one frightened child. Liren looked at Raiden. The boy looked at her. The marshal's men began to move. Shadows stretched long across the dirt. Night came fast, and with it came the moment when they had to run. Fight or surrender. The climax was now only one breath away. Night fell fast, swallowing the last line of sunlight and leaving Greystone washed in deep blue shadows. The air held the sharp scent of dust and distant sage, and the tension felt like it had hands of its own, gripping every person who dared breathe. Raiden stood steady in front of Liren and the boy, the darkness outlining the powerful shape of his shoulders. The marshal's men shifted in the distance, ready to close in. The sheriff looked torn, but his mind was made. Coulter held his rifle at his side, unsure but no longer hiding from his conscience. Raiden whispered to Liren that it was time. They could not wait for Kellen to make the first move. She looked down at the boy, whose frightened eyes searched hers. She told him they would run, but he would not be alone. He nodded, and held her hand tightly. Whatever he had survived, he understood that staying meant being taken away again. The sheriff moved closer and told Raiden that he would buy them time. He knew the canyon Raiden spoke of. He said it was narrow, rugged, and old as the land itself. Horses could pass through the first part, but only if someone drew the marshal's men in the opposite direction. Raiden agreed, understanding the weight of what the sheriff offered. He told him that truth would someday reveal what side he had chosen. Coulter stepped beside his leader. He said he would help too. He had worn the badge long enough to know a wrong when he saw one, and this was bigger than fear. The sheriff placed a hand on his shoulder, was grateful for the courage growing in the young deputy's chest. Huxley tried to interfere, shouting that this was treason. He said anyone helping the Apache would pay for it. But the sheriff turned to him with a glare sharper than any blade. He told Huxley he had abused his power long enough. He was done watching fear rule the town. Huxley opened his mouth to argue, but the sheriff ordered him to step aside or turn in his badge. Huxley stepped back, shocked by the shift of authority. Raiden picked up the boy, settling him on his hip with steady hands. Liren gathered her courage and walked beside him, her heartbeat steadying with each breath. She didn't know what waited in the canyon, but she knew she would rather face wildland with Raiden than surrender the boy to Kellen's men. The first gunshot cracked across the dark. It wasn't aimed at them, but it signaled the marshal's order. The sheriff and Coulter mounted their horses and charged down the main street, shouting loudly to draw the riders toward them. Kellen's men took the bait. They believed the boy was being moved through the west side, and with the sheriff leading the chase, they followed without question. Liren Raiden, and the boy ducked into a narrow alley behind the mercantile. Moving quickly toward the south edge of town, Merrick stepped out quietly, handing Liren a small satchel of bread and water. He whispered that he had children too, and no child deserved to be hunted. Liren thanked him and hurried on. When they reached the edge of Greystone, Raiden whistled once, low and sharp. His stallion trotted from behind a cluster of juniper bushes, as if waiting for his call. Raiden lifted the boy onto the saddle, then helped Liren climb up behind him. She wrapped her arms around the child to keep him steady. Raiden mounted behind her, his presence strong and reassuring. He clicked his tongue, and the stallion surged forward. Hooves beating against the open land, they crossed the dark field toward the canyon. Moonlight spilled in thin strokes, enough for Raiden to guide the way. The distant chaos faded behind them as the marshal's men chased shadows in the wrong direction. Liren kept watching the boy's face, the way he leaned into her as if she was the first real home he had found. The canyon appeared as a deep cut in the earth, narrow and rugged, framed by towering rocks that looked like old guardians. Raiden led the horse through the first turn, where the path opened just enough for a careful rider. As they rode deeper, the air cooled, and the noise of pursuit faded entirely. They reached a small hollow hidden between stone walls. Raiden dismounted first, helping Liren and the boy down. For the first time since morning, Liren felt her chest loosen. The boy clung to her skirt, exhausted. Raiden checked the canyon entrance, making sure no one had followed. When he returned, the hard tension in his shoulders finally eased. Liren sat on a rock, letting the boy rest against her side. Raiden knelt in front of them, his voice softer than she had ever heard. He told the boy he had done nothing wrong. He told him the carving he carried held truth that could protect many families. He said they would keep it safe until the right hands could see it. The boy whispered that he knew Raiden would come for him. Liren's heart tightened at those words. She asked Raiden if he knew the child's family. He nodded. The boy's parents had been close friends of Raiden's people, families who believed in peace and cooperation between frontier settlers and Apache clans. The treaty marker they carried was meant to protect both sides, but greed had twisted men like Kellen, who saw cooperation as a threat rather than a promise. Liren listened, her eyes glistening with respect for the life Raiden fought to protect. She said the boy was safe with them, and she meant it with every part of her soul at dawn. The sheriff arrived at the canyon entrance with Coulter. They had shaken off Kellen's men by leading them through the ravines east of town. Their clothes were dusty and their horses tired, but relief lit their faces when they saw Raiden, Liren, and the boy unharmed. The sheriff explained that he confronted Kellen again after confusing his men long enough. He told Kellen the carving had been found. The marshal's reaction exposed more than his words. His anger, his fear, and his attempt to reclaim control showed everyone around him that he wasn't acting under lawful duty but under personal motives. With Coulter's witness and the testimony of several townsfolk who had seen the boy's distress, the sheriff formally suspended Kellen's authority in Greystone until a higher tribunal could investigate. Kellen tried to resist, but without cooperation from the town, he had no power left. His extra riders fled the moment they realized Greystone stood united against them. The news spread quickly through the frontier. A marshal abusing his badge for personal gain was no small matter. Within days, territorial investigators began riding toward Greystone. The sheriff delivered the carving as evidence and sent word about the destroyed camp. Justice, for once, began working in the right direction. The boy, now safe, clung to Liren whenever strangers approached. Raiden told her his people would welcome the child and give him a home among them. But the boy shook his head. He wanted to stay with Liren. He trusted her warmth, her steady strength. Raiden smiled at that and said the boy had made his choice. Greystone slowly returned to its rhythm. Fear loosened its hold on the town. People who had once watched from windows now greeted Liren with gratitude. Merrick offered to stock her pantry for the winter. Ranch women invited her to supper. Even those who once doubted her now understood the bravery she had shown. Raiden remained in Greystone while the investigation continued. He helped repair the broken fences on farms, guided lost cattle, and stood quietly beside Liren whenever she went to the market. The townsfolk grew to respect him, not out of fear, but for the quiet honor he carried. Liren's life changed in ways she never expected. The boy, whom she named Aaron, brought laughter back into her home. Raiden became a steady presence, visiting her porch in the evenings when the land glowed under sunset. Their bond grew naturally, as gently as morning light warming cold soil. When the tribunal declared Kellen guilty of corruption and misuse of authority, the news spread across the frontier. His badge was stripped, and those who followed him fled the territory. The truth of the burned camp was documented. Bringing peace to the memory of those lost, Raiden came to Liren's door one quiet evening, the sky deep with stars. He told her he planned to stay near Greystone, to help rebuild what fear had broken, and to stand with her and Aaron if they wished it. Liren felt warmth spread through her chest. She told him they wanted him close, that he was already part of their small, unexpected family. Raiden placed his hand over Aaron's head. Then gently over Liren's, he said that even in a land filled with danger and hardship, good hearts could still meet and form something strong. The frontier night wrapped around them, peaceful at last. Graystone learned that courage from ordinary people could change fate. Liren learned that compassion was more powerful than fear. Aaron learned that he was no longer alone. And Raiden found a place where his spirit could rest after years of wandering. Their story became one of the many, whispered through the old American frontier, a tale of hope, justice, kindness, and the strength that grows when unlikely souls stand together and in the quiet glow of a new sunrise. Their lives finally opened toward a gentle, hard-earned happy ending.